The morning fog hung thick over Arlington National Cemetery as Private First Class Marcus Williams began his 21 steps across the black mat. Each step was measured, precise, and purposeful. The sound of his polished boots echoed against the marble of the tomb of the unknown soldier, creating a rhythm that had remained unchanged for decades. Marcus had been walking this post for 18 months, and every single step still filled him with the same sense of honor and responsibility he felt on his first day. The tomb guard duty was not something that came easily. Marcus had spent months in training, learning every detail about the tomb, memorizing the names of every unknown soldier buried in American cemeteries around the world, and perfecting the precise movements that honored those who had given their lives for their country. His uniform was immaculate, pressed to perfection, with every button polished until it gleamed like a mirror. The rifle he carried was inspected daily, and his knowledge of military history was tested regularly. Only the best soldiers were chosen for this sacred duty. As Marcus turned at the end of his walk, he noticed a small group of visitors approaching the tomb. Among them was a woman in her 70s walking slowly with the help of a cane. She wore a simple black dress and carried a small bouquet of white roses. Her eyes were fixed on the tomb with an intensity that Marcus had seen many times before, from family members of fallen soldiers. What made this visit different was the man walking beside her, a tall, distinguished figure in a perfectly pressed military uniform, adorned with 4 stars on his shoulders. General Robert Harrison was not a man who visited Arlington Cemetery casually. As one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Army, his time was precious and his schedule packed with meetings, briefings, and important decisions that affected thousands of soldiers around the world. Yet here he was on a quiet Tuesday morning, accompanying an elderly woman to pay respects at the tomb. The general's face was stern, his jaw set in the way that had intimidated countless junior officers throughout his career. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, a no-nonsense leader who demanded excellence and had little patience for anything less than perfection. The elderly woman, Margaret Thompson, moved slowly toward the chain that separated visitors from the tomb. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her cane, but her determination was clear. She had traveled over 1,000 miles to be here, carrying with her a story that had remained buried for over 50 years. The roses in her hand were not just any flowers. They were grown in her own garden, the same variety she had planted decades ago in memory of someone very special to her. General Harrison watched the tomb guard's movements with the critical eye of a military professional. He had inspected countless honor guards throughout his career, and he knew what to look for. Every step should be exactly 21 inches. The pause at each end should last exactly 21 seconds. The weapon should be transferred from shoulder to shoulder in a precise sequence that had been perfected over generations of guards. As he observed Marcus's performance, the general's expression remained neutral, but his eyes missed nothing. Marcus was aware of the general's scrutiny, but he continued his duty without falter. He had performed this ritual thousands of times in blazing summer heat, bitter winter cold, driving rain, and blinding snow. The tomb was guarded 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, regardless of weather conditions. This dedication was not just a job for Marcus. It was a calling that connected him to every unknown soldier who had died in service to their country. The morning sun began to break through the fog, casting long shadows across the white marble. Margaret Thompson stepped closer to the chain, her eyes now filled with tears that she had been holding back for decades. She whispered something under her breath, words that only she could hear, words that carried the weight of a lifetime of grief and unanswered questions. The roses in her hand seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. General Harrison noticed the woman's emotional state and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Despite his reputation for toughness, he understood the profound impact that loss could have on a family. He had delivered too many death notifications to families throughout his career, had seen too many tears shed over folded flags and final salutes. Yet something about this particular visit felt different to him, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. As Marcus completed another sequence of his walk, he caught sight of the elderly woman's face. There was something familiar about her expression, something that reminded him of photographs he had studied during his training. The tomb guards were required to learn about the history of the unknown soldiers, about the families who had lost loved ones whose remains were never identified. Could this woman be connected to one of those stories? The general's phone buzzed quietly in his pocket, but he ignored it. This moment seemed too important to interrupt with the mundane concerns of military bureaucracy. He watched as Margaret Thompson raised her hand slightly, as if she wanted to speak to the tomb guard but was unsure if it was appropriate. The protocols around the tomb were strict, and interactions between guards and visitors were limited to specific circumstances. Marcus maintained his professional demeanor, but his heart was beginning to race. Something about this visit was different from the thousands of others he had witnessed. The combination of the four-star general, the elderly woman with her roses, and the intensity of emotion in the air created an atmosphere that felt charged with significance. He could sense that this was not just another routine visit to pay respects. The fog continued to lift, revealing more of the cemetery's landscape. Row upon row of white headstones stretched across the rolling hills, each one marking the final resting place of a man or woman who had served their country. The tomb itself stood as a symbol for all those whose final resting places remained unknown, whose families never had the closure of knowing where their loved ones were buried. As Margaret Thompson stood there, clutching her roses and fighting back tears, she knew that the moment she had traveled so far for was finally at hand. The truth she carried had remained hidden for over 50 years, but today, in the presence of this four-star general and this dedicated young soldier, she was finally ready to reveal a secret that would change everything they thought they knew about duty, honor, and sacrifice. Margaret Thompson's voice trembled as she finally spoke, breaking the ceremonial silence that surrounded the tomb. "Excuse me," she called softly to Marcus, who was in the middle of his precise 21 steps. "I need to tell you something important about my grandson." Marcus stopped mid-stride, his training warring with his human curiosity. Protocol dictated that he should continue his walk without interruption, but something in the elderly woman's voice made him pause. General Harrison's eyebrows furrowed as he watched the tomb guard break from his routine. In all his years of military service, he had never seen a sentinel stop his duties for a visitor's request. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but the guard cannot be interrupted during his duty," General Harrison said firmly, stepping forward. His voice carried the authority of decades in command, and he was prepared to escort the woman away if necessary. The protocols surrounding the tomb of the unknown soldier were sacred, and he would not allow them to be violated, regardless of the woman's age or apparent emotional distress. But Margaret Thompson turned to face the general with a strength that surprised him. Her tears had stopped, and in their place was a determination that spoke of years of carrying a heavy burden. "General, with all due respect, what I have to say concerns this tomb and the young man buried here. My grandson Tommy Thompson died in Vietnam in 1969. He was 19 years old." Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. He knew the stories of the unknown soldiers by heart. The Vietnam unknown had been buried in the tomb in 1984, after years of ceremony and honor. But in 1998, advances in DNA technology had allowed the military to identify the remains as those of Air Force First Lieutenant Michael Joseph Blassie. The Vietnam unknown was no longer unknown, and his spot in the tomb now remained empty, a testament to the power of science to bring closure to families decades later. General Harrison's expression softened slightly, but his military bearing remained intact. "Ma'am, I understand your loss and I honor your grandson's service. However, the Vietnam unknown was identified years ago, and his remains were returned to his family. Your grandson's case would have been handled through proper military channels." Margaret shook her head slowly, her grip tightening on her cane. "That's where you're wrong, General. My grandson was never properly identified because the military made a mistake 50 years ago. They told our family he was missing in action, presumed dead, but they never found his body. We never got to bury him, never got to say goodbye." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "But I know he's here in this tomb and I can prove it." The morning air seemed to grow heavier as Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a weathered manila envelope. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it, revealing a collection of documents that looked official and important. "I've spent 30 years investigating my grandson's disappearance. I've written to congressmen, filed Freedom of Information Act requests, and tracked down every soldier who served with Tommy in Vietnam." Marcus found himself genuinely torn between his duty and his curiosity. The tomb guard training had taught him that his primary responsibility was to honor the unknown soldiers through his unwavering dedication to the post. But here was a woman claiming that one of those soldiers might not be unknown after all. The implications of what she was saying could shake the very foundation of what the tomb represented. General Harrison stepped closer to examine the documents Margaret was holding. His skepticism was evident, but his sense of duty to any military family compelled him to listen. Mrs. Thompson, I understand your desire for closure, but the identification of remains is a complex scientific process. The military doesn't make mistakes about something this important. But they did make a mistake, Margaret insisted, pulling out a faded photograph of a young man in military fatigues. This is Tommy, taken 3 weeks before he was killed. And this, she said, producing another document, is a letter from his squad leader written 20 years after the war ended. He tells a very different story about what happened to my grandson's body. The photograph showed a smiling young soldier who couldn't have been much older than Marcus himself. There was something about the young man's eyes that spoke of the same dedication and honor that Marcus felt every day as he walked his post. The resemblance between the grandmother and her grandson was unmistakable, and the pain in Margaret's face as she looked at the photograph was heartbreaking. Marcus knew he was breaking protocol, but he couldn't help himself. What does the letter say, ma'am? General Harrison shot him a warning look, but Margaret was already unfolding the handwritten pages. Sergeant First Class William Rodriguez wrote this letter to me in 1989. He was Tommy's squad leader in the 173rd Airborne Brigade. For 20 years he carried the guilt of what happened, and finally he couldn't keep it secret anymore. She began to read from the letter, her voice growing steadier with each word. He says that Tommy was killed during a patrol near the Cambodian border. But when they tried to evacuate his body, they came under heavy enemy fire. They had to leave him behind along with another soldier who had also been killed. The next day, when they returned to retrieve the bodies, they found only one set of remains. The implications of what Margaret was saying began to sink in. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what she might be suggesting. General Harrison's face had gone pale, but he maintained his composure. Mrs. Thompson, are you saying that your grandson's remains were misidentified? I'm saying that the military assumed the remains they found belonged to the other soldier, Private James Mitchell, because they found his dog tags near the body. But Tommy's dog tags were never found. Margaret's voice cracked slightly. Sergeant Rodriguez always believed they brought back the wrong soldier. He says the remains were too decomposed to make a visual identification, and they didn't have DNA testing back then. Marcus thought about all the ceremonies he had witnessed at the tomb, all the wreaths laid by visiting dignitaries, all the moments of silence observed by thousands of visitors. If Margaret was right, then everything about the tomb's meaning could be called into question. The unknown soldiers were supposed to represent all those who had died without identification. But what if one of them actually had a name and a family who had been searching for him for decades? General Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents Margaret had presented. His military training told him to be skeptical of claims that could undermine the integrity of such an important national monument. But his experience as a soldier and a leader had taught him that sometimes the truth was more complicated than official reports suggested. Mrs. Thompson, he finally said, these are serious allegations. If what you're suggesting is true, it would require a complete investigation by military authorities. The process of exhuming and testing remains is not something that can be done lightly. Margaret nodded, understanding the gravity of what she was asking. I know, General. I've been trying to get someone to listen to me for years, but every time I contact the military, I get form letters telling me that the case is closed. I'm 78 years old and I don't know how much time I have left. I just want to know if my grandson is finally at rest, or if he's still waiting for someone to bring him home. The roses in her hand seemed to represent more than just a simple memorial offering. They were a symbol of a grandmother's unwavering love and determination to find the truth about her grandson's fate, even after 50 years of uncertainty and bureaucratic roadblocks. General Harrison found himself in an impossible position. Military protocol demanded that he maintain the dignity and sanctity of the tomb, but the documents Margaret Thompson had presented were troubling enough to warrant serious consideration. As he examined the letter from Sergeant Rodriguez more closely, he noticed details that only someone who had actually served in Vietnam would know: specific unit designations, geographical references, and military terminology that would be difficult to fabricate. Marcus watched the exchange with growing unease. His entire identity as a tomb guard was built around the honor of protecting soldiers whose names would never be known. The possibility that one of those soldiers might actually have been identified decades ago challenged everything he believed about his duty, yet he couldn't ignore the pain in Margaret's eyes or the authenticity of the documents she carried. "Mrs. Thompson," General Harrison said carefully, "I need you to understand that what you're asking could have far-reaching consequences. The tomb of the unknown soldier represents more than just the individuals buried here. It's a symbol of sacrifice for all those who died in service to their country. Any investigation would need to be handled with extreme sensitivity." Margaret straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't accessed in years. "General, I've spent half my life wondering if my grandson was alone somewhere in a foreign country, or if he was here, being honored as he deserved. Either way, I need to know the truth. Tommy was my daughter's only child. She died 10 years ago, still wondering what happened to her son. I made a promise at her funeral that I would never stop looking for answers." The weight of her words settled over the three of them like a heavy blanket. Marcus had never considered what it might be like for families who never received closure, who spent decades wondering about the fate of their loved ones. The ceremonies at the tomb suddenly seemed different to him, not just honors for the unknown, but potential sources of pain for families who might be watching their own loved ones being remembered under the wrong name. General Harrison pulled out his phone and walked a few steps away, placing a call to someone at the Pentagon. His conversation was brief and conducted in the low tones of someone discussing classified information. When he returned, his expression was grim. "Mrs. Thompson, I've just spoken with the Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel. He's agreed to meet with us this afternoon to review your evidence." Margaret's hands trembled as she carefully returned the documents to their envelope. "Does this mean you believe me, General?" "It means I believe you deserve to have your questions answered by people who have access to information I don't," Harrison replied diplomatically. "But I need you to understand that this process could take months or even years. Military investigations are thorough, and the scientific testing required to confirm or deny your claims is complex." Marcus realized that his shift was scheduled to end in an hour, but he found himself reluctant to leave. Something about Margaret's story had captured his imagination and touched his heart in a way that surprised him. "Ma'am, if I may ask, how did you know to look for Sergeant Rodriguez? How did you even know to start investigating?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Tommy used to write me letters from Vietnam. He was always very careful not to worry me, but he mentioned Rodriguez several times. He said the sergeant was like a father to all the young soldiers in their unit. After the war ended and I never heard anything definitive about Tommy's fate, I started writing letters to every Rodriguez I could find who had served in the 173rd Airborne." She paused, lost in the memory. "It took me 15 years to find the right man. When I finally reached Sergeant Rodriguez in 1984, he hung up on me. He called me back 3 hours later crying. He said he had been carrying the guilt of leaving Tommy behind for all those years, and he had never forgiven himself for not being able to bring both boys home." General Harrison was beginning to understand the scope of Margaret's investigation. This wasn't the desperate fantasy of a grieving family member. This was a methodical, decades-long search for truth that had uncovered potentially significant discrepancies in official military records. "What else did Sergeant Rodriguez tell you?" "He told me about the firefight, about how they had to leave the bodies behind, about coming back the next day to find only one set of remains. But most importantly, he told me something that was never in any official report." Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "He said that when they found the body, it was wearing Tommy's jacket. Private Mitchell had lost his jacket in a river crossing 2 days before they were killed. Tommy had given him his spare jacket to keep him warm." The implications of this revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. If Rodriguez was telling the truth, then the remains had been identified based on dog tags found near a body that was actually wearing the wrong soldier's clothing. The margin for error in such a scenario was enormous, especially given the battlefield conditions and the state of decomposition after 24 hours in the tropical climate. General Harrison was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the significance of what he had heard. Finally, he spoke. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to personally escort you to the Pentagon this afternoon. I'm also going to contact the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory to discuss the possibility of reopening this case." "But General," Marcus interjected, surprising himself with his boldness, "what happens if Mrs. Thompson is right? What happens to the tomb? It was a question that cut to the heart of a complex moral and symbolic dilemma. The tomb of the unknown soldier had been a source of comfort and inspiration for millions of Americans. It represented the nation's commitment to honoring those who had made the ultimate sacrifice, even when their individual identities had been lost. But what did it mean if that honor was being given to someone whose identity was actually known, while another family suffered without closure? General Harrison looked at the tomb, then at Margaret, then at Marcus. If Mrs. Thompson is right, then we have a responsibility to correct a decades-old mistake, regardless of how difficult or painful that process might be. The honor we show to our fallen soldiers has to be based on truth, not convenient assumptions. Margaret reached out and gently touched Marcus's arm. Young man, I want you to understand something. If my grandson is buried in this tomb, I'm not angry that he's been honored here. I'm proud that he's been given such a sacred resting place. But I need to know if he's here so that our family can finally grieve properly, and if he's not here, then I need to keep searching for him. The morning sun was now fully visible, casting the tomb in a warm golden light. Visitors were beginning to arrive in larger numbers, preparing to witness the changing of the guard ceremony. Marcus realized that his replacement would be arriving soon, and that this extraordinary encounter would soon become part of his memory rather than his immediate reality. But as he looked at Margaret Thompson's determined face and General Harrison's troubled expression, he knew that this was just the beginning of a story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, honor, and the true meaning of service. The roses in Margaret's hand seemed to glow in the morning light, carrying with them the hope of a family that had waited 50 years for answers. The Pentagon meeting that afternoon was unlike anything General Harrison had experienced in his 30-year military career. Margaret Thompson sat across from a panel of senior officers, including the Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, the Director of the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory, and 2 representatives from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Her manila envelope lay open on the conference table, its contents spread out like pieces of a complex puzzle that had taken 50 years to assemble. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead forensic anthropologist from the DNA lab, examined the documents with the careful attention of someone who had spent years identifying remains from conflicts around the world. She had worked on cases from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and more recent conflicts, but she had never encountered a situation quite like this one. The possibility that a misidentification had occurred at the tomb of the unknown soldier was unprecedented and deeply troubling. Mrs. Thompson, Dr. Chen said gently, I want you to understand that what you're proposing would require exhuming remains from one of our nation's most sacred sites. This is not a decision that can be made lightly, and it would require approval from the highest levels of government. Margaret nodded, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Despite being surrounded by high-ranking military officials in one of the most powerful buildings in the world, she maintained the same quiet dignity she had shown at the tomb that morning. Doctor, I understand the gravity of what I'm asking, but I also understand that my grandson deserves to have his identity restored if he's been buried under the wrong name for 50 years. Colonel James Patterson, the Deputy Chief of Staff, leaned forward to examine the letter from Sergeant Rodriguez more closely. Mrs. Thompson, our records show that Sergeant Rodriguez was debriefed after the incident you're describing. His official statement at the time made no mention of any concerns about misidentification. With respect, Colonel, Margaret replied, a 19-year-old private and a 23-year-old sergeant don't question their commanding officers when they're told which body belongs to which soldier. Sergeant Rodriguez told me that he had doubts at the time, but he was ordered to accept the identification based on the dog tags that were found. General Harrison had been quiet during most of the meeting, but now he spoke up. I've reviewed the case files from 1969, and I have to say that the identification procedures used at that time were far less sophisticated than what we use today. Given the battlefield conditions and the state of the remains, it's not impossible that an error could have occurred. Dr. Chen pulled out her laptop and began accessing database records that contained detailed information about every unknown soldier from the Vietnam conflict. Mrs. Thompson, you mentioned that your grandson's dog tags were never found. Do you have any documentation about when and how his death was officially confirmed? Margaret reached into her purse and produced another folder, this one containing official military correspondence dating back to 1969. Tommy was declared killed in action, based on witness statements from his squad members. But his body was never recovered from the original location. The remains that were eventually sent to the Unknown Soldier program were found 3 days later, in a different location about half a mile away. This new information caused a stir around the conference table. Colonel Patterson made notes rapidly while Dr. Chen pulled up topographical maps of the area where the incident had occurred. The possibility that 2 separate recovery operations had led to confusion about which remains belonged to which soldier was becoming more plausible with each piece of evidence Margaret presented. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Chen said, "do you have any biological samples that could be used for DNA comparison if we were to proceed with testing?" Margaret smiled for the first time since the meeting began. "I've been preparing for this possibility for 20 years, Doctor. I have hair samples from Tommy's childhood hairbrushes, which my daughter saved. I also have medical records that include blood type information and dental records." The thoroughness of Margaret's preparation impressed everyone in the room. This was not the desperate grasping of a family member unable to accept loss. This was the methodical documentation of someone who had spent decades building a case based on evidence and scientific possibility. General Harrison looked around the table at his colleagues, reading their expressions. He could see that Margaret's presentation had shifted the conversation from skeptical dismissal to serious consideration. "Dr. Chen, what would be involved in testing the remains currently in the tomb?" "The process would require a full forensic examination, including DNA extraction and comparison with the samples Mrs. Thompson has provided. We would also need to examine the remains for any identifying characteristics that might have been missed in the original identification process." Dr. Chen paused, considering the complexity of the situation. The entire process could take 6 to 12 months, and it would require closing the tomb to the public during the examination period. The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications of what Dr. Chen had described. The tomb of the unknown soldier had never been closed for an extended period since its dedication. Millions of visitors came to pay their respects each year, and the changing of the guard ceremony was one of the most solemn and respected traditions in the American military. Colonel Patterson was the first to speak. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to ask you directly. If our investigation proves that your grandson is not buried in the tomb, will you accept that result and end your search?" Margaret looked him directly in the eye. "Colonel, if DNA testing proves that Tommy is not in the tomb, then I will know that he's still out there somewhere waiting to be found. Either way, I will finally have an answer. That's all I've ever wanted." Her response demonstrated a level of acceptance and grace that impressed even the most skeptical officers in the room. This was not about creating a controversy or seeking attention. This was about a grandmother's love and a family's need for closure after 5 decades of uncertainty. Dr. Chen closed her laptop and gathered her notes. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to recommend that we move forward with a preliminary investigation. This will involve reviewing all available records from 1969 and consulting with surviving members of your grandson's unit. If that investigation supports your claims, we will then consider proceeding with the forensic examination." General Harrison stood up, signaling that the meeting was concluding. "Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that regardless of what we discover, your grandson's service and sacrifice will always be honored. If he is in the tomb, then he has been receiving the highest honors our nation can provide. If he's not, then we will do everything in our power to bring him home." Margaret carefully returned her documents to their folders, her movements deliberate and respectful. "General, I want to thank you and everyone in this room for listening to me. I know this isn't easy for any of you. The tomb means as much to me as it does to every American. I just want to make sure that the soldier buried there is being honored under his true name." As the meeting ended and the officials began to file out, General Harrison remained behind with Margaret. "Mrs. Thompson, I have to ask you something. What made you so certain that you needed to speak up today? You've been investigating this for 30 years. Why did you choose this moment to approach the tomb guard?" Margaret smiled sadly as she gathered her things. "General, I'm 78 years old and my health isn't what it used to be. But more than that, I had a dream last week. I dreamed that Tommy was calling to me, telling me it was time to bring him home. I know that might sound foolish to a military man like yourself, but sometimes a grandmother just knows when it's time to act." General Harrison found himself moved by her simple faith and determination. As they walked out of the Pentagon together, he realized that this case would test not only the military's commitment to truth and accuracy, but also its ability to balance respect for tradition with the demands of justice and family closure. 3 months after Margaret Thompson's visit to the tomb, the preliminary investigation had uncovered disturbing inconsistencies in the 1969 military records. Dr. Chen's team had located and interviewed 4 surviving members of Tommy Thompson's unit, including Sergeant Rodriguez, who had maintained his story about the jacket exchange and his doubts about the identification. More troubling was the discovery that the original incident report had been filed by an officer who was later court-martialed for falsifying documents in unrelated cases. General Harrison found himself personally invested in the investigation in a way that surprised him. He had visited Margaret Thompson twice at her modest home in Ohio, bringing updates on the progress and seeing firsthand the wall of photographs and documents she had assembled over the decades. Her dining room had been converted into a research center, with boxes of correspondence, newspaper clippings, and military records that told the story of a family's unwavering search for truth. Marcus Williams had followed the investigation closely through official military channels and news. Reports that had begun to emerge as word of the case leaked to the media. The story of the grandmother who challenged the Pentagon had captured public attention, dividing opinion between those who supported her quest for truth and those who felt she was disrespecting the sacred nature of the tomb. Marcus found himself defending Margaret's actions to fellow soldiers who questioned whether the investigation was worth the controversy it was generating. The decision to proceed with exhuming the remains came down from the Secretary of Defense himself, after consultation with the President and congressional leadership. The announcement was made on a Friday afternoon, carefully timed to minimize media attention, but the news still created a firestorm of debate across the country. For the first time in its history, the tomb of the unknown soldier would be closed to the public for an extended period, while forensic scientists conducted their examination. Margaret Thompson was invited to be present when the exhumation took place, a gesture of respect that acknowledged her role in bringing the case to light. She arrived at Arlington Cemetery on a cold December morning, accompanied by her son David, who had flown in from California to support his mother through what could be the most important day of her life. General Harrison met them at the cemetery gates, his breath visible in the frigid air as he escorted them to a location where they could observe the proceedings. The exhumation itself was conducted with the same military precision and respect that characterized every aspect of the tomb's operations. A team of forensic experts led by Dr. Chen carefully removed the casket while an honor guard maintained formation nearby. The process was filmed for official records, ensuring that every step of the investigation could be documented and reviewed. Dr. Chen's preliminary examination of the remains took place in a temporary laboratory that had been set up in a secure building adjacent to the cemetery. Margaret and her son waited in a nearby conference room, drinking coffee that had long since grown cold and speaking in hushed tones about memories of Tommy that had sustained them through 5 decades of uncertainty. After 6 hours of initial examination, Dr. Chen emerged from the laboratory with news that would change everything. The remains showed evidence of dental work that was inconsistent with Tommy Thompson's dental records, but remarkably consistent with the records of Private James Mitchell, the soldier who had originally been identified as the unknown. Furthermore, fabric analysis revealed fibers that matched the description of Tommy Thompson's jacket. Supporting Sergeant Rodriguez's account of the clothing exchange, General Harrison felt a complex mixture of emotions as Dr. Chen delivered her preliminary findings. Relief that the truth was finally emerging was tempered by the realization that the military had spent 50 years honoring one soldier under another's name. The implications for military identification, procedures, and family notification processes would require a complete review of protocols dating back decades. Margaret Thompson's reaction to the news was quieter than anyone had expected. She simply closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Thank you, Tommy, for waiting for me to find you." Her son David wrapped his arms around his mother, and for the first time since the investigation began, she allowed herself to cry tears of relief rather than frustration. The DNA testing that followed confirmed what Dr. Chen's initial examination had suggested. The remains in the tomb belonged to Private James Mitchell, not Tommy Thompson. Mitchell's family, who had spent 50 years believing their son was buried in a military cemetery in Virginia, were notified of the discovery and invited to participate in discussions about how to proceed. The revelation created a diplomatic crisis within the military establishment. How do you correct a 50-year-old mistake that has become one of the most sacred symbols in American military culture? How do you explain to the families of both soldiers that their loved ones had been misidentified for half a century? Most importantly, how do you maintain the dignity and honor of the tomb while acknowledging such a fundamental error? General Harrison was tasked with developing a plan that would address these concerns while respecting the wishes of both families. Margaret Thompson had made it clear that she wanted Tommy's remains returned to her family for proper burial, but she also insisted that Private Mitchell deserved to continue receiving honors appropriate to his service and sacrifice. The Mitchell family, shocked by the revelation but grateful for the closure it provided, expressed similar sentiments about wanting both soldiers to be properly honored. The solution that emerged was unprecedented in military history. The tomb would be rededicated to honor both soldiers, with a new inscription acknowledging the identification of both men and their service in Vietnam. Private Mitchell's remains would be returned to his family for burial in the location of their choosing, while Tommy Thompson's remains would need to be located through expanded search efforts in Vietnam. Marcus Williams volunteered to be part of the honor guard that would participate in the rededication ceremony. He had been profoundly affected by Margaret Thompson's courage in challenging the system, and by the military's willingness to confront its mistakes honestly. The experience had taught him that true honor came not from blindly following tradition, but from having the courage to seek truth even when it was uncomfortable or inconvenient. The media coverage of the investigation's outcome was intense, with opinions divided about whether Margaret Thompson was a hero for her persistence or a troublemaker who had disrupted an important national symbol. But for those who had been directly involved in the case, the questions were simpler. Had justice been served? Had the truth been honored? Had two families finally received the closure they deserved? As Margaret Thompson prepared for the journey back to Ohio, she carried with her the knowledge that her grandson's identity had been restored and that the search for his remains could finally begin in earnest. The roses she had brought to the tomb 3 months earlier had long since withered, but the love and determination they represented had borne fruit in ways she had never imagined possible. General Harrison watched her leave the cemetery with a profound sense of admiration for the elderly woman who had refused to give up on her grandson. She had taught him that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or strategy, but with patience, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to truth. 2 years later, Margaret Thompson stood once again at Arlington National Cemetery, but this time the circumstances were entirely different. The tomb behind her had been beautifully restored and rededicated, now bearing an inscription that honored both Private James Mitchell and Private First Class Tommy Thompson by name. The investigation that had begun, with her desperate plea to a young tomb guard, had evolved into the largest review of military identification procedures in American history. The ceremony taking place that morning was unlike any other in the cemetery's long history. Private Mitchell's remains had been reinterred in his hometown cemetery in Nebraska, surrounded by family members who had finally received the closure they had never known they needed. But Margaret was not here for Private Mitchell's ceremony. She was here because after 18 months of intensive searching in Vietnam, Tommy Thompson's remains had finally been found. General Harrison, now retired but still deeply involved in the case, stood beside Margaret as the honor guard carefully carried a flag-draped coffin toward the gravesite that had been prepared for Tommy. The search team had located his remains at the exact location Sergeant Rodriguez had described in his letter, a small clearing near the Cambodian border, where 2 young soldiers had made their final stand against overwhelming odds. Marcus Williams, now a sergeant himself, and serving as the leader of the honor guard, moved with the same precision he had demonstrated as a tomb guard, but with a deeper understanding of what the ceremony represented. The months following Margaret's initial visit had changed his perspective on military service, teaching him that honor came not just from following orders but from having the courage to question them when truth and justice were at stake. The Vietnamese government had been remarkably cooperative in the search efforts, allowing American teams access to areas that had been off limits for decades. The discovery of Tommy's remains had been made possible by advances in ground-penetrating radar and GPS technology that could pinpoint locations based on 50-year-old descriptions from surviving veterans. Along with Tommy's remains, searchers had found his dog tags, his personal effects, and the skeletal remains of the military equipment he had been carrying when he died. Dr. Chen, who had become something of a celebrity in forensic anthropology circles due to her work on the case, had personally overseen the identification process. The DNA match with Margaret's samples had been conclusive, finally providing scientific proof of what a grandmother's heart had known for 50 years. More importantly, the investigation had led to the identification of 17 other unknown soldiers from the Vietnam conflict, bringing closure to families who had waited decades for answers. As the ceremony began, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The manila envelope that had contained her evidence was now part of a permanent archive at the National Museum of American History, where it would serve as a testament to the power of ordinary citizens to effect extraordinary change. The letters from Sergeant Rodriguez, the photographs of Tommy, and all the documents she had painstakingly collected over 3 decades had become historical, artifacts that told the story of how determination and love could overcome even the most entrenched bureaucratic systems. The military establishment had struggled initially with how to handle the revelations that had emerged from Margaret's investigation. The discovery that misidentifications had occurred not just in Tommy's case but in multiple cases dating back decades had led to a complete overhaul of military casualty procedures. New protocols now required multiple forms of identification before remains could be classified as unknown, and families were given much greater access to information about their loved ones' cases. General Harrison had testified before Congress about the lessons learned from the Thompson case, emphasizing that the military's commitment to honoring its fallen soldiers required a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about past mistakes. His testimony had been instrumental in securing funding for expanded efforts to identify unknown soldiers from all conflicts, not just Vietnam. As the honor guard performed the final salute and presented the folded flag to Margaret, she thought about her daughter, who had died without ever knowing what had happened to her son. The flag would join the collection of Tommy's belongings that Margaret had preserved for 50 years. But more importantly, it represented the end of a half-century of uncertainty and the beginning of peace for a family that had never stopped hoping for answers. The media coverage of Tommy's burial was extensive, but Margaret had learned to navigate the attention with grace and dignity. She had become an inadvertent spokesperson for military families seeking information about missing loved ones, and her story had inspired dozens of other families to renew their own searches for answers. The Margaret Thompson Foundation, established with donations from around the country, now provided resources and support for families dealing with similar situations. Marcus Williams approached Margaret after the ceremony, his own eyes moist with emotion. "Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that serving as Tommy's honor guard today was the greatest privilege of my military career. Your grandson is finally home, and he's being honored the way he should have been 50 years ago." Margaret smiled at the young soldier who had grown into a leader partly because of their encounter at the tomb. "Sergeant Williams, Tommy would have been proud to know that soldiers like you were keeping watch over his memory. You and General Harrison taught me that the military is made up of good people who are willing to do the right thing, even when it's difficult." As the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, Margaret remained at Tommy's graveside for a few more minutes. She placed a small bouquet of white roses on the fresh earth, the same variety she had carried to the tomb of the unknown soldier 2 years earlier. But these roses were different. They represented not a desperate search for answers, but a grandmother's final act of love for a grandson who had finally come home. General Harrison joined her at the graveside, and they stood together in comfortable silence. "Mrs. Thompson," he finally said, "you've changed the way the military thinks about its responsibilities to families. Tommy's legacy extends far beyond his service in Vietnam. He's helped bring closure to families all across the country." Margaret nodded, understanding that her grandson's story had become part of something much larger than her own family's tragedy. "General, I think Tommy would have liked that. He always wanted to help people, even when he was just a boy. Maybe this was his way of continuing to serve." even after all these years. As she walked away from the cemetery that day, Margaret Thompson carried with her not the burden of unanswered questions that had defined her life for 50 years, but the peace that comes from knowing that love, persistence, and courage can triumph over even the most daunting obstacles. The tomb guard who had listened to her story that foggy morning had become a symbol of how individual acts of compassion and courage could change the world in ways that no one could have imagined. The tomb of the unknown soldier continued to serve as a sacred memorial to all those who had died in service to their country, but it now also stood as a reminder that true honor required a commitment to truth, no matter how difficult that truth might be to accept. And somewhere in the rolling hills of Arlington National Cemetery, Tommy Thompson finally rested in peace, surrounded by the love that had never stopped searching for him and the honor that had always been his due.